Okay, so what are the aims of today's session then? First of all, we're going to, as I've mentioned, we're going to review candidate performance in the June 2012 series. We're going to look at the requirements of the controlled assessment material in Unit 2. We're going to consider some examples of learners' work to identify why marks were awarded. And then we're going to look at key requirements when assessing learners' work. If you can just bear with me for 2 minutes because I think that my sound is not very clear despite having done a sound check. So I'm not 100% certain that you can hear me and I'm not sure what to do. So just bear with me one moment. Okay, thank you, Carl. And apologies again, delegates. Hopefully you can hear me now. So just to recap, the aims to review candidate performance from the last series, to look at the requirements of the controlled assessment material in Unit 2, to consider some examples of learners' work and identify why marks were awarded, and to identify key requirements when assessing learners' work. Okay, so first of all, we're going to have a quick poll. We had a quick poll at the beginning, which actually showed that most of you were relatively new to this particular qualification. That this was the first year that you have been delivering it. And there is a specific poll, which I wonder if Renee could just bring up, that will give me more accurate information about how new you are to the subject. So if you could have a look at this poll and then vote in terms of whether you're new to it or whether you have been teaching for a little while. Okay, thank you. So that's very clear. I'll broadcast that now and you can actually see that in fact 52% of you, so over half of you, are brand new to delivering, and a further 17% have only been delivering the qualification for 1 year. So most of you are new to the qualification, so I think it's really important that we look at how you can best deliver this qualification and what the actual assessment is looking for. Thank you, Renee. If we can go back to the presentation. Thank you. So, it's always quite good to look at what happened last year to prepare well for next year. So if we look at the key issues from June 2012 for Unit 2, first of all, there was a full cohort of learners, and that's quite important because what it means is that the feedback that we can give you is based on a representative number of portfolios. We actually saw quite a lot of portfolios. And as in previous years, in fact, there was some excellent work seen from some learners. Some learners, some centres had clearly got their head around the qualification and understood how to provide the evidence, and perhaps importantly for you, understood how to assess the evidence. There appeared in the summer to be a clearer understanding of the requirements of the specifications over and above 2011. However, there were still some issues remaining. One of the issues centres around what the interpretation of controlled conditions, and although this was better this series, there were still a significant number of entries where portfolios were very similar, and that indicates a lack of individual work. One of the things that we saw was a number of centres who were clearly using templates for their students to actually guide them through. Now, a template, it does not allow a student to evidence independent work because obviously they are being led through what sort of evidence they need to provide. And although the template is allowed, what it means is that you have to adjust your marking accordingly to say that students have not worked independently. I'll come back to that in a little while. Another issue was the choice of service provider and service user. A large proportion of learners had chosen service users within the early years group, indicating that perhaps they had been given the wrong assignment. Now, the key thing, and again this is something I will come back to later, the key thing with this unit is that the controlled assessment material is only valid for 1 year, and you must ensure that your learners are actually undertaking the assignment that is relevant for the year in which you are going to present the assignment for assessment. And it is quite important and even more difficult to get it right now that the qualification has become linear. And again, I will look at that in a little bit more detail later. But that was one of the issues from last year, and what it means is if they've been given the wrong assignment, then they don't necessarily meet all the requirements of the tasks, because the tasks do change. Another issue was the fact that there was limited evidence of what we call holistic assessment seen, and holistic assessment is required for this qualification. In the old GCSE, each task was assigned to an assessment objective. And so when students did task 1, you assessed it against assessment objective 1. When students did task 2, you assessed it against assignment objective 2. But in the new qualification, there is evidence for each assessment objective in every task. And again, we'll look at it in more detail for me to explain what I actually mean by that. But holistic assessment is really important for this new qualification. Generally, there was poor application of knowledge seen. Now, the assessment objective 2.2 assesses the student's ability to apply their knowledge and understanding. And this was generally not done well, and in particular with relation to the care values and also to the hierarchy of needs. And that's what one of the exercises that you're going to be doing in a little while will cover. And finally, as is quite common in learners of this age and also slightly older, there was very limited ability very limited evidence seen of an ability to evaluate in the majority of portfolios considered. It is a difficult skill for 14, 15-year-olds, but nevertheless, it wasn't well evidenced, but assessors had assessed it as though it was well evidenced, and that is a major issue. So that's again something that we're going to be looking at in more detail further on in the presentation. I mentioned right at the start of that one of the issues centres on controlled conditions, and many centres struggle with what controlled conditions means. And so we've got a poll here for you just to answer a little quiz for you. The actual slide says answer true or false, but I think the poll has been changed slightly for you to answer which ones are true. So there are just 8 questions, and if Renee could bring up the poll for this, and if you could just spend a few minutes just going through the 8 questions and answering which ones you think are true and which ones you think are false, and I'll just give you a few minutes to do that. Okay everyone, thank you. I think everybody has voted on that, and there's some interesting answers that have come up, so it's useful to go through what is actually meant by control conditions. So Renee, if you could just remove the poll so I could go back to the presentation. Thank you very much, just easier for me to see. Okay, so if we go through these questions then, controlled conditions means that learners have to work under exam conditions. In fact, that is actually, that is actually false in terms of exam conditions being the desk with the student not allowed to talk to anybody and not allowed to talk to you. They don't have to do that. They can work in groups, for example, which is one of the questions. Can they work together in groups on their assignments? Yes, they can. And within the controlled conditions, to a certain extent, they can work. They can use their group work. So it's quite acceptable for. You don't have to have them in silence, sitting in an exam environment. So working in exam conditions is actually not true. Research undertaken on placement may be brought into the controlled conditions room. Yes, it can. However, it must be raw data. They must not have made any comment on the research that they have undertaken. They must not have analysed any of the data that they have undertaken at all, but they can bring the data into the control conditions room. Question 3, learners may write up their notes from their research at home. No, they may not. All write-up for their controlled assessment must be done within the controlled conditions environment, so within the classroom. Nothing must be written up at home, and that goes back to question 2 in terms of research, where there must be no analysis of data done outside of the controlled conditions. Question 4, learners can only spend 22.5 hours writing up their portfolios. That is false. 22.5 hours is a guideline. It's suggested. If you have plenty of time to enable them to spend in controlled conditions, then they can have as much time as you have available. It's suggested 22.5 hours because obviously you have other things to do. And also a lot of centres may not have access to a controlled environment for that length, for any more time than that, and in fact some centres have said that they don't even have that amount of time. So that is just a guideline. If you want to give them more than 22.5 hours to spend writing up their portfolio under controlled conditions, then you can do that. That's not a problem. Question 5, I think you all answered false for that, which is absolutely correct. Learners can save their work onto their own area and work on it in their free periods. No, they cannot. All work must be collected in at the end of the controlled session, and you must keep it safe, and they can only have their assignments back when they go into the controlled environment again. Learners may only bring raw, unanalysed data into the controlled assessment environment. I've already covered that in terms of question 2. Yes, that is true. They may only bring raw, unanalysed data into the controlled assessment environment. They can work in groups on their assignment, and in fact for the majority of learners that's probably what's going to happen. We are aware that it is very difficult for learners to actually all get individual placements. And in fact, for some learners at this age, in year 10 and year 11, it's impossible for them to get placements. Early years centres, residential care homes won't allow students in to the placement to have practical experience. And so therefore it might be that you are using guest speakers or you're using a case study, in which case all the learners will have the same case study, and in which case if there's a guest speaker coming in, for example, you can't have 20 learners all asking them questions. They would need to work together to devise a questionnaire so that you could then ask joint questions. So it's quite acceptable for learners to work together in groups on their assignments. And this slide just recaps some of that. There's a choice between 2 of the 4 service user groups, and as I've identified already, you must make sure that you get the correct assignment. The report must be completed under controlled conditions, as I've said. No analysis of primary and secondary data. Information and resources determined by you as a centre may be accessed during the write-up, and this includes the internet. There's been quite a lot of discussion just recently on actual face-to-face sessions that I've done about whether learners can access the internet during the controlled conditions environment. And the answer to that is yes, they can. However, you have to monitor what they are accessing. You have to monitor how long they are spending accessing, given that they've got limited time to write up their whole assignment. If they're spending ages accessing the internet, then they're not going to get the work done. So you have to monitor that very closely. And if you decide that you're not going to let them access the internet, that is your decision. Right? But there is no steadfast rule that they cannot under the controlled assessment environment. And if you look at the actual the guidance within the specification, it does say that they can actually access resources as determined by you. Work must be collected in, I've already mentioned already, and the 22.5 hours is classroom time. It doesn't include research time. I did have one centre last year who said that there was no way they could do all the research and the write-up in 22.5 hours. The 22.5 hours suggested is for the write-up. They can spend as much time as they want actually undertaking the research. The pre-release material for learners submitting in May 2013 has been available since September this year, and learners should choose from one of two service user groups. It is either early years or residential care. Now, to clarify that, early years is any child under the age of 8. So any service provision that is offering care for children under the age of 8. So that would be things like private day nurseries, nurseries attached to reception to primary schools, reception classes, year 1, children's centres, playgroups, although playgroups are not that good because you don't get the range of services. Neither would I advise you to use childminders, because most childminders just have a single service that they offer, and that is the core service of care, and it's very difficult therefore to answer some of the tasks that are in the other, some of the elements that are in some of the other tasks. So my advice would be to look at, as I said, day nurseries, nurseries attached to schools, primary, year 1, children's centres would be good examples. Residential care would apply to any age, so it doesn't have to be care of the older adult. It could be care of people with specific needs. It could be children's homes, if there are any in your area. There's not very many left now, but that it's any service provider that provides residential care for anybody, right? But not hospitals or nursing homes, because that is health care. So you want to focus in on the social care element of it, right? I also mentioned slightly earlier that centres, you need to note now that the qualification is linear, and this has implications for the assignment that your learners complete. And it's very important that you get the right assignment. So your learners are currently in year 10 and registered on the double award. Which assignment should they be working on? If they're registered on the double award, then you're going to be cashing that qualification in for them in June 2014. And so therefore, for Unit 2, they need to work on the assignment that will not be released until September 2013, because they have to present everything at the end of their qualification when they are cashing in. So if your students are in year 10 and registered on the double award, they cannot start the assignment for Unit 2 until September 13. If your learners are currently in year 10 and are registered on the single award, then they will be presenting their assignment in May 2013. So it's the one that is currently available. And then one question that has come up a lot is, can you then register them on the double award in year 11? And the answer to that is yes. So you can register them on the single award now and get units 1 and 2 out of the way in year 10. And then in year 11, you re-register them onto the double award and they can do units 3 and 4. But I need to clarify that if they are currently in year 10 and they are registered on the double award, they cannot enter any unit until June 2014. So the introduction of the linear qualifications means, as I say, that you must ensure learners are complete the correct assignment and submit at the correct point in their course. Assessment must take place at the end of the qualification when you are applying for cash-in. So learners in year 10 registered for the double award must undertake all assessment at the end of year 11, and they must complete the assignment for Unit 2 dated September 2013 to May 2014. I do think that that assignment is currently available on the EdExcel website, so they can start work on it now if you want, but you do not present it for the qualification until the end of 2014. Okay, let's look in a little bit more detail now then at the actual tasks of the unit and what you have to do. Each assignment comprises usually 4 tasks. Sometimes there may be 5, it does vary, but the tasks will address all elements of the syllabus. It may be that some elements of the syllabus will not be included in some assessment material, but the full syllabus will be covered over the period of 5 years. What that means is that you cannot just pick what you're going to teach. If you start, for example, teaching in year 10 and you're not assessing until year 11, you can't just pick little bits to teach. You have got to ideally teach the whole syllabus, because you're not sure what is going to come up, and this applies to the examined units as well. So it's important that the whole syllabus is covered. The tasks will vary, and they may be presented in a different order from year to year, so don't always expect that task 1 will look at the needs of the individual and task 2 will look at service provision. It may vary, so be prepared for that. The tasks will also cover the requirements of the assessment objectives and will require the learners to provide evidence of recall and selection of appropriate knowledge and understanding, planning and carrying out investigations including research, application of knowledge and understanding, and analysis and evaluation. And those 4 bullet points refer to the 4 assessment objectives. So AO1 is recall and selection of knowledge and understanding, AO21 is planning and carrying out investigations including research, AO22 is the application of knowledge, and AO3 is the analysis and evaluation. And all of the tasks on the assignment will cover all of those assessment objectives. So if we have a quick look at the assignment for this summer then, for summer 2013, the learners must choose, as I've mentioned already, an early years setting, and there's some examples there for you, or a residential care setting, and again I've given a couple of examples there for you. Task 1 on the current controlled assessment is looking at the actual services available for your chosen service provider. The task asks the learner to provide or to design a leaflet or advertising material for the chosen service provider, which includes a description of the three different services offered, and I'll come back to that in a minute, a description of how the chosen service provider fits into the national framework, and an identification of an external agency and how they work in partnership with the service provider. Now, when we were writing these assignments, we tried to make them as interesting as possible for the learners. Hence the reason we suggest that they produce a leaflet or advertising material, because many of the learners really enjoy using IT, showing off their IT skills. However, can I please point out that if they don't provide a leaflet, if they just provide their evidence in a Word document, they should not be marked down. The presentation is merely a tool to make the task more interesting for them. There is nothing in the assessment criteria that would assess their ability to produce a leaflet, so we cannot assess their ability to produce a leaflet. What we assess, or what you assess I should say, is their ability to show their knowledge and understanding. And their knowledge and understanding will be evidenced throughout the assignment, so this is just one element of it. So the first part of the task then, the bullet point 1, learners need to identify 3 different services provided by the service provider, including the core service, and then they need to describe them. Identifying 3 different services and describing them will provide evidence for AO1, because they are showing their knowledge and understanding. The fact that they have actually done that and they have planned to do that and will provide a little bit of evidence for AO21, but mainly in terms of describing them will provide evidence for application of that knowledge. So you're going to get evidence here just in this little task for AO1 and AO22. Now the 3 services, the core service is the main service, so if you choose a private day nursery, the core service of a private day nursery is care of the children. Two other services that the students might want to choose would be things like a breakfast club or a holiday club or an after-school service. They would be additional services that they could describe. And so that would form their three services. So you've got the core service of care of the children during the period that the nursery is open, and then two additional services that are provided by the nursery. And this is why I said earlier on that although a childminder does fit into the criteria for early years service, it will be more difficult for learners to actually produce the evidence for here, because childminders generally, not always, but generally only offer the core service of childcare. The second bullet point then requires them to describe how their chosen service provider fits into the national framework. Early years could be the education sector, residential care, maybe social care, and you will need to decide which sector it fits into. It does become difficult, and we do appreciate that the national framework is a bit of a nightmare, particularly when you're thinking about the health service, which changes so regularly. So what we're looking for here is some sort of general understanding that there is a framework, a structure within which their chosen service provider fits. If it's a nursery that's attached to a school, it's relatively easy because you can describe the education service and where the nursery fits in. If it's a private day nursery, it becomes a little bit more difficult because officially it fits into social care. And that's the route that you would go, but also it's private, so it becomes a little bit tenuous in terms of the links. So the sort of thing that we would be looking at there would be the structure of the framework and briefly where the funding comes from. Right? So, for example, a private day nursery, the majority of the funding comes from the fees that the parents pay, but there will also be an element that comes down from the government via social services in terms of vouchers, etc. So a brief description of that as well, and that will meet the requirements of that task. And again, that will provide evidence for AO1 and AO2 too. And hopefully you're beginning to see how holistic assessment is really important, because you're getting evidence. One task is giving you evidence for different elements of the actual syllabus and for different assessment objectives. Finally, for this task, learners should identify an external agency which is involved in the care of service users accessing the chosen service provider. An external agency would be anybody that is not employed directly by the service provider that you are considering. So, for example, if you're looking at a nursery attached to a school, it might be that the speech therapist comes in to see children, and the speech therapist comes from the primary care trust, or the health visitor comes in and does some collaborative work with the nursery. So they would be some examples of external agencies. If you're thinking about residential care, let's say it's a residential care home for older adults, then it might be that the chiropodist, again from the primary healthcare trust, comes in. Or it might be that the optician comes in to do regular sight tests for the elderly, or glaucoma testing, or something like that. So they would be external agencies that they need to identify, and they just need to identify one, and then they should describe how they work collaboratively. So it's really looking at how the person from the external agency and the service provider that you are describing work together closely, how they communicate, how they make sure that messages are passed on, and that there's a joint care plan for the service user. It doesn't need to be looking at in great detail at care planning, but they do need to have some idea that there is that collaborative working going on. Moving on to task 2. Task 2 considers the service user. So for the first section, learners should identify their current physical, intellectual, emotional and social needs, and that provides evidence for AO1. Fairly straightforward. They should also try to identify their potential future needs. Now that can be a little bit difficult, particularly if they're considering the older adult in a residential care home. The easiest way to do it for the majority of service users is to look at their next developmental stage. So, for example, if they're looking at children in early years, look at the next developmental stage and what they will need then. If they're in nursery, the next stage, if you like, is going to be going to school, and so they could look at their needs when they go to school. In terms of the older adult, it is slightly more difficult to look at the next developmental stage because there isn't really one. But they could look at their condition and see how it might deteriorate, or how, as the aging process takes hold, if you like, how things are going to change and what they might need in terms of care. So, for example, their mobility is going to decrease, so what might their future needs be if their mobility decreases? It could be that, you know, their ability to hear is going to decrease, so they may need help there. So those sorts of things that you could actually look at. I'm monitoring the questions as I'm going along, and I've just seen a question from Laura that says, are all of the bullet points mentioned going into task 1? The slide that I just covered, Laura, the slides are actually numbered, task 1, task 2, so we're now on to task 2 bullet points, and there are 5 bullet points in task 2. The initial bullet points that we're looking at, the service user, that was task 1, so we're now looking at task 2. Okay, I hope that answers your question. And Andrew, in terms of can you use a secondary school that's linked to the primary school, the service users won't be early years, so I'm not quite sure how you would use a secondary school. You would be looking at the primary school and looking at the children, because it's the service users that you need to focus on, and the service users have to be early years. You then need to look at how the service user can meet the current needs. So the learner has identified the current physical, intellectual, emotional and social needs, and then you need to look at how the service user can meet those needs. What services is the service user providing? In task 1, you have looked at the generic services. In task 2, the learners need to look at specific services that are offered to meet the needs of the specific service user. So slightly different focus, a slightly different emphasis. And when you're looking at how a service user can meet current needs, what you're doing, or what the learner is doing, is applying their knowledge and understanding. And so therefore, this particular bullet point will provide evidence for AO22. Application of knowledge and understanding. They then need to look at the various methods of referral and how the service user might have been referred to the service provider. Various methods of referral are, they need to look at professional referral, third-party referral and self-referral. And ideally what they should do is identify those, describe those, and then say how the service user has been has been referred. The various methods of referral is knowledge and understanding. Applying it to the service user is application. So again, you've got evidence for AO1 and AO22 here. And then finally, they need to look at the barriers, actual and potential, which may prevent the service user from accessing the service provider. And there's some examples there. They should look ideally at physical barriers, that's those concerned with the built environment. They should look at psychological barriers, things like not wanting to go to school, not wanting to leave home, for example, not wanting to leave their own home and go into residential care, those sorts of things. Geographical barriers concerned with location, Organisational barriers concerned with communication and language, or maybe access, not physical access, but for example, if a mum is wanting to put her child into a nursery and it doesn't start until 9 o'clock, but they have to get to work at 8 o'clock, then there's an organisational barrier there. And also financial, fees for example. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at a question again. Laura has said, shouldn't bullet point 4 read service provider, not service user? No, it's bullet point 4 in task 2 is the different ways in which the service user might be referred to the service provider. So there's both there. I'm presuming that that's the bullet point that you're referring to, Laura. I'll come back to some of the other questions because there's some quite complicated ones, so I will come back and answer all the questions later on, so don't worry. Okay, let's move on to task 3. For task 3, the learners have this task actually considers the job roles of workers within the service provision, and the learners need to select 2 workers. One must be direct and the other must be indirect. So first of all, they need to understand the difference between a direct carer and an indirect carer, and they need to explain that. They have to use both primary and secondary research here, and if they don't go into a placement, if you can't get a placement for them, getting primary research might be an issue. And the best way that I can suggest you get primary research is to get an outside speaker in. So if you're talking about a primary school, you could get a teacher in. If you're talking about residential care home, you could get one of the carers in, and the learners can then ask questions, and as I said earlier, they can pool their questions, so the poor guest speaker doesn't have loads and loads of questions coming. They can all ask the same questions and they get their primary research that way. The independent work will come from them analysing the results of that questionnaire independently, on their own, not as a group, and then they will have worked independently. And that's the best way of actually providing primary and secondary research. They need to understand, as I said already, that they understand the difference between direct and indirect carers, and that provides evidence for AO1. They need to describe the main roles of both workers, and again that's evidence for AO1. They need to identify the skills and the qualifications needed by the workers. And they need to explain those, so that's skills and qualifications. The learners should describe the care values in detail, and then they should provide good examples of how both workers implement relevant care values, and this provides evidence for AO2 too. And this is perhaps the area where most learners do struggle. In order to get into the higher mark bands, they have to describe the care values in detail. It's not just enough to list what the care values are. They have to show that they understand them and what that actually means for the service user. What we do get here, and what we do find here a lot, is that they do just tend to copy from the textbooks, and they shouldn't do that. It should be in their own words. Again, if it's copied from the textbook, it's not evidence of independent working. So having described all the care values in detail, they should then provide good examples of how both workers implement relevant care values. It doesn't necessarily have to be all of them for the workers, it has to be relevant ones for the workers, but they should have described all of them to start with, and that will give them good evidence for AO22. And then finally, to meet the requirements of AO21, which is planning and research, the learner could include a plan of how and where they are going to obtain their information. And this task lends itself quite nicely to that because of the primary research that is required. So if they identify that they're going to speak to somebody, they could actually have an action plan of how they're going to contact them, when they're going to come in, what questions they're going to ask, and have a plan that will give them some evidence for AO21. I'll look in detail a little bit more at AO21 when we look at the actual assessment objectives. Finally, task 4 requires an evaluation of how effective the service provider is at meeting the needs of the service user. And it provides the evidence, the majority of the evidence that the learners will need for AO3. The key thing about this is that evaluation requires consideration of the strengths and the weaknesses of the provision, and then they must draw some conclusions, and this is what they're not very good at doing. It will require the learner to consider those needs which are met well by the service provider and where there are gaps. Weaknesses in provision could be addressed by reflecting on barriers to access, for example. So if there are lots of barriers to access, that immediately is a weakness, and they're not, the service provider is not meeting the needs of the service user. If they can't, if they're struggling to find weaknesses in the current provision, then they could look excuse me, they could look at how efficiently the service provider would meet the needs of the future needs, and whether they would, whether they would be able to meet the future needs. That would be another way that they could actually evaluate the service provision, by looking at future needs and how effective they would be. They should also make realistic suggestions for improvement, and do check that the suggestions are realistic. A classic example that I got once was on physical barrier to access, where the school was at the top of the hill, and the learner had actually said that in the winter when the weather was bad, excuse me, the pupils couldn't get to the school. So their suggestion was to move the school to the bottom of the hill. Okay, so that's a brief overview then of the actual the tasks for the assignment for May 2012. What I'm going to go on to now is looking at how you assess it. Now, the key thing to bear in mind is that assessment must be undertaken using the assessment criteria that you'll find on pages 21 to 23 of the specifications. Nothing else. There are guidelines out there that tell you the sorts of things that you can put in your assignment, the sorts of things that you should be looking for, but the key thing is that you use the assessment criteria that are on pages 21 to 23. And as I've said already, AO1 considers knowledge and understanding, AO21 planning and investigation, AO22 application of skills, and AO3 analysis and evaluation. The other thing to bear in mind, and this is something that is different to the old GCSE, is that the quality of written communication is also assessed throughout the assessment objectives, and you do have to bear that in mind when you're awarding marks. One of the difficulties that a lot of assessors find with the new qualifications is that the assessment criteria are quite generic in their nature. They don't give you specifics to look for, and that is very different to how they used to be, and that actually does cause problems for some of the assessors, because they're not quite sure how to handle it. So, as I've mentioned already, the assessment criteria need to be applied to the tasks in hand. Each assessment criterion is divided into 5 mark bands. And apart from AO3, the mark bands are quite narrow, and so it should be clear which mark band to place the learner in. You have to make the decision on how much help has been required, and therefore whether the learner has used their own initiative and worked independently. You should make some comment on the learner's work as to how much assistance has been required. It is acceptable for you to help the learner, but you must take that into account when you come to award marks, and it's particularly relevant for AO21. That is where you assess the level of independent work. So, yes, you can help the learner, but you must take account of it when you come to award marks. For AO3,
If there's no clear evidence of evaluation, learners cannot access the top 2 mark bands. So there has to be some evidence that the learner has looked at the strengths and the weaknesses of the service provision. If there isn't, then you can't put them above mark band 3. So that's again something to bear in mind. So let's look then at the individual assessment criteria. So assessment objective 1 is recall, select and communicate knowledge and understanding. This assessment objective considers the learner's ability to recall and select appropriate information, so it's assessing their knowledge and understanding. And the different mark bands are used to differentiate those learners who have excellent recall and are able to work independently and express themselves clearly from those who require help to put their portfolio together. All tasks within this assignment will provide some evidence for this assessment objective, and so it's vital that you consider the whole assignment before awarding marks for AO1. What a lot of centres do is that they allow the learners work on a task-by-task basis. So they'll undertake task 1 and hand that in, and then you will mark it. And that is fine, but you cannot award a final mark for AO1 until you've seen all 4 tasks, because all 4 tasks will allow students to access marks for AO1. It's also vital that clear annotation is added to the assignment to show where the learner has provided evidence for AO1 and also for the other 3 assessment objectives. It is quite acceptable for you to annotate the work. What you should do is, if you read a paragraph or an element within a learner's work, in the margin put AO1 or AO2 1 or AO3, whatever. That is quite acceptable. Some assessors are also like to put the mark band in the margin. We don't pay any attention to that when we come to moderate. We will pay attention to the assessment objective, but one sentence in the middle of a page of writing doesn't indicate that a learner is operating at mark band 3. So the mark band, or mark band 4 or whatever, so the mark band can really only be determined when you have assessed the whole assignment. So as far as I'm concerned, there is no value in putting the mark band in the margin. It's just the assessment objective. The varying tasks will also produce evidence for the range of context. So this is something that I get a lot of questions on, because many assessors feel that learners have to do some sort of comparison between their service provider and another service provider to provide a range of contexts. But in fact, the tasks themselves provide the range of contexts, because they will be showing their knowledge and understanding of the needs of the service user, so that's one context. They will be showing their knowledge and understanding of the services provided by the service provider, so that's another context. They will be providing their knowledge and understanding of the job roles, so that's another context. Excuse me. So you can see that the range of context is covered by all the tasks, so you don't need to worry anymore about the range of contexts. If they do all the tasks, they will meet the range of contexts. Okay. AO21 requires the learner to plan and carry out investigations and tasks. So this assessment objective is assessing the learner's ability to plan how they are going to obtain their information and also their methods of research. And it considers their ability to work independently. I mentioned earlier that where a structured template is given to all learners, this limits the marks available, as it cannot be truly classed as independent work because you've told them what to do. Again, evidence for this assessment objective will be found throughout the portfolio, and so clear annotation is vital. The difference between the mark bands is identified through the learner's need for support and also the range of sources used. So a limited range of sources for mark band 2 will probably be 2 or 3 sources, probably all web-based. Mark band 3 actually says different sources, so 3 or 4 primary and secondary sources. Mark Band 4 again requires a range of sources, but it's linked to independent research, and so therefore the learner must have been able to identify these sources themselves, as opposed to you directing them as to where to find the information. And finally, Mark Band 5 requires a wide range of sources, and this has been interpreted as 4 or more different types of source: textbooks, journals, primary research, websites, etc. The other thing that evidences AO21 is their ability to actually complete all the tasks. So if each task has several subtasks, if you like, and if they have missed some of those subtasks, then they haven't been focused and they haven't planned and carried out those tasks, and so therefore they can't access marks in the top mark band. So as an example, in June 2012, we had an awful lot of people, an awful lot of candidates who didn't address the requirement that looked at outsourcing. And so they missed that part of the task out completely. Now, having missed that part of the task out, they haven't planned and carried out all their investigation and tasks at a level that would give them marks in the top mark band. So that's something to look out for. If they have missed out elements of the tasks, then you would need to adjust the marks accordingly. AO22 is application of knowledge and understanding. So it's assessing their ability to apply their knowledge in the variety of contexts. And as I've already mentioned, it also assesses the learner's understanding of care values and how they underpin care practice. This assessment objective also assesses the quality of written communication, and it's focused here on spelling, punctuation, the use of grammar, and the use of specialist vocabulary. The difference between the mark bands will be determined by how well the learner is able to apply their knowledge across all the tasks. So again, you need to annotate carefully. Their knowledge and understanding and their application of the care values need to be discussed in depth and applied in practice, and clear examples are required to demonstrate understanding of application for Mark Band 5. And finally, for Mark Band 5, the quality of written communication must be excellent. The learner must have a secure command of English. When you're assessing the quality of written communication, if it's poor, or if you feel it, that there's poor spelling, there's poor grammar, limited use of specialist vocabulary, but the actual content is good, then what you would do is just drop the mark to the bottom of the relevant mark band. So, for example, if you have put the learner in mark band 4 for AO23, so let's say you've awarded them 8 marks, but their quality of written communication is not fluent, which is what is required for mark band 4, you would not take the learner down into mark band 3, you would just give them 7 marks. And I would annotate that to say why you've dropped the work. So the content is actually marked, and then their application skills actually means that they're in the middle or towards the top of mark band 4, but because their quality of written communication is poor, you've knocked them down to 7. What that does is it assesses their quality of written communication, but it doesn't penalise those students too much who perhaps English is not their first language. But there has been an assessment there. So that is the general rule, but please do make a note on the student's work that is why you have awarded that mark and given them 7 marks. Okay. I've done an awful lot of talking, and as you can probably tell, my voice is failing a little bit, unfortunately. So now I'm going to have a break, and you're going to do a little bit of work. You have got two scripts that should have been sent to you with the pre-event material, but if they weren't sent to you, or if you haven't got them, don't worry, because Renee is going to bring them up onto the screen for you to look at, and you will also get control of the screen, so you'll be able to scroll through the scripts. So the first activity is to look at script HC. You're not going to look at the whole script, you haven't got time to look at the whole script. What I want you to do is to go to the section that talks about care values. and I want you to read through the care values and look at, you also have the assessment criteria on the screen as well for AO22. Read through the care values element of this script and then look at what you what mark you think it should have got. And in fact, I'm just looking now, and we've actually got the answers up there. So what I would suggest is that you look at the script first and see if you agree with the mark. There is a poll that actually asks you to award a mark, but because the assessment criteria the actual comments are up, you're going to see the mark anyway, so we won't worry about the poll. But have a look through and see what your comments are about the script, and then you've got a box that says activity chat, and you can put some comments in there, and I can come back to those comments when you've finished. So I'm going to give you if I can just give you 10 minutes. So it's now 6 minutes past 5, so if we come back at 5:15. Thank you. So I'm going to sign off and let you have a look at that script and just focus on the care values and see what you think about the mark that was awarded. Okay, everyone, it's just gone 5:15, so I've come back online now. I'm looking at the comments. Some of you may have spotted a deliberate mistake in that the assessment criterion grid that was up was not the one for the actual portfolio that you were looking at. Now I don't know whether that swayed you or not, because quite a few of you have put it in Mark Band 3. Some of you have put it at the top of Mark Band 4, and some of you have actually put it in Mark Band 5. When we actually get the right assessment grid up, you will see that it was in actual fact put into Mark Band 5, and it was given just at the bottom of Mark Band 5, and it was given 10 marks. Now, this it's not an ideal situation for you here because you're just looking at the care values, and of course, as I've said, the whole of the assessment criterion is also looking at application of knowledge and skills throughout, and so therefore application of the hierarchy, application of needs, etc., will also be taken into account for this particular mark band. So it's a little bit difficult, but I think those of you who have sort of opted for Mark Band 3 stroke top of Mark Band 3 and into Mark Band 4 purely on the care values are approximately right, but you need to take everything else into account as well. She had actually given a reasonable, or shown a reasonable understanding of care values for both workers. She discussed the care values quite well, and she showed clear understanding, whilst at the same time demonstrating an ability to apply her knowledge by providing relevant examples. Other elements of application that she had done was she'd applied her knowledge quite well for Maslow's hierarchy, for example, in Task 1, and Task 3 also demonstrated an ability to apply her knowledge well on job roles. However, there were some errors. Her work on referral methods was weak. This is general. You haven't had time to look at all of this, but this is essentially what you will find if you look at the portfolio in more detail. And she got some errors as well. It just gives you an indication of the fact that you've got to look at the whole assignment before you can award marks. Yes, the care values are really important, and yes, she perhaps could have given more detail in terms of the care values and sort of built them up a little bit, but she showed good application skills elsewhere in her portfolio, and that's what put the mark up in total. So that was given 10 marks. Okay, if we can go back to the presentation now, please. Thank you. So that's the application of knowledge and understanding. We're now going to look at analysis and evaluation, which is AO3, and this is the one where most learners really struggle. So this assessment objective is assessing the learner's ability to analyse and evaluate information, and again the quality of written communication is also assessed. Analysis requires the learner to consider all the key aspects of the topic in detail. So for example, in terms of care values, the good portfolio should have a discussion of all the care values, followed by a comprehensive discussion of those specific care values implemented by their chosen care worker. So again, you can see that although AO3 is very much focused on evaluation, there is also analysis there, and so there's going to be evidence for AO3 throughout the portfolio, but the main emphasis is on evaluation. Okay. Evaluation requires the learner to consider the strengths and weaknesses of the particular situation, in this case, how effective the service provider is at meeting the needs of the service user, drawing relevant conclusions to demonstrate understanding. And it also requires, as I've mentioned, the learner to make suggestions for improvement. Those two elements are linked directly to task 4. So task 4 is going to form the bulk of the evidence for this particular assessment objective, with an allowance for an ability to analyse seen throughout the other tasks. So the difference between the mark bands will be determined through evidence of the following. Mark band 2 will be limited, if any, evaluation, mainly descriptive, with inaccurate spelling, punctuation and grammar. Mark band 3, basic evaluative skills, so some evidence of strengths and weaknesses seen, but the descriptive conclusions are drawn, and often the suggestions for improvement are not always realistic, and frequent inaccuracies in quality of written communication. Mark band 4, there has to be clear analysis and evaluation seen. Remember I said earlier that if there's no evidence of evaluation, really, then learners cannot access mark band 4. So there has to be clear evidence of evaluation. Conclusions should be drawn, but they may still be a little bit descriptive. But there should be some good suggestions for improvements, although they may not always be fully reasoned. So they are realistic, but there may not be good reasons as to why those improvements have been suggested. That is what gets them into mark band 5. Excellent analytical and evaluative skills. The work is presented logically, independent thinking is clearly evidenced, well-considered conclusions have been drawn, and suggestions for improvements are realistic and are justified throughout. And again, the quality of written communication is accurate throughout. Again, the same thing applies here for the quality of written communication. If the content is good, if the learner has provided a really good analysis and evaluation of the evidence, but the quality of written communication lets it down, you just take them to the bottom of the mark band. If they are already at the bottom of the mark band, so if you decide to give them, let's say, 7 marks, you don't drop them into the next mark band, you just leave it, okay? Okay, so I'm going to look at the second activity now, and again you're looking at the same 2 scripts. You're looking at the script, if you look at HC again now and look at the evaluation, right? So look at task 4 and just read through task 4 and decide which which mark band you would put this particular script in for evaluation. And then after you've done that, you're going to look at script TM, which is a second script, and see which mark band you would put them in for evaluation. I'm going to give you a little bit longer for this one because I'd like you to look at both scripts. So it's now 23 minutes past 5. If you could come back to me at 5:45. So what I want you to do first is look at the script HC and put that in a mark band for task 4 for AO3, and then look at script TM and put that in a mark band for the same task. So you're just looking at task 4. Okay? Okay everyone, I'm coming back to you because we're just changing the order slightly and we're going to bring up TM in a minute. I think most of you seem to have voted, and there's been some interesting comments in the comments box. The majority of you, well, it's changing as I speak. Initially, the majority of you had gone for band 4, but in fact, actually, the majority of you now have gone for band 3, which is the 5 to 8 votes. it was actually put into Band 4, and in fact towards the top, well, at the top of Band 4. And the main reason was that, again, the learner had evidenced analytical skills throughout. There were some very good analytical skills, and the learner had made a very good attempt at evaluation. Some suggestions for improvement to most aspects of the service, although they weren't all fully reasoned, and there were some unrealistic ones, hiring an experienced nurse, for example. The QWC was very good throughout. Some of the comments that you have come up with, I've been monitoring the comments in the activity chat, and some of you have said, that some of the suggestions were unrealistic, but some are good. I think, Andrew, you said that, which is true. One of the things I will say is that we don't we don't negatively mark, it's all positively marked. So, it's when you positively mark, you allow them the the benefit of the doubt, if you like, and what that means is that where there are good suggestions, you can actually you can allow for those and disregard the unrealistic suggestions. So it can be a little bit difficult, but what you want to be doing is positively marking all the time, and the fact that they actually did come up with some good suggestions and some realistic suggestions, they're the ones that you go for, and sort of ignore the other ones. So that's why it was placed in that mark band. She had made a reasonable attempt at actually evaluating. It was probably one of the better ones that we saw last year, to be honest, in terms of her evaluation skills. There were definitely strengths and weaknesses there. She had definitely drawn some conclusions. It was well written. And what you have to bear in mind is, although we say there needs to be strengths and weaknesses there, at the end of the day, this is a 14-year-old, and that level of work was actually quite good. So so that was why it was given that amount of that number of marks. Okay, what I'm going to do now is to ask Carl or Renee if they could bring up TM, and if you could do the same with TM, then it will, you can have a look at that and have a look at her ability to evaluate and do a comparison. So if we could bring up TM, and again, if you could have a look at that one, looking again at task 4, looking again at the evaluation, and putting that in the mark band that you think is appropriate, and then we'll have a look at that as well, and I'll just give you some other clues afterwards. Okay, everyone, I've come back now because most of you have actually put a mark on, and it seems to be a pretty even split between Band 2 and Band 3. One thing that has occurred to me is that one person actually published what mark they gave and said that they put it at the bottom of mark Band 2, and I just wondered if, I think it was Andrew, if Andrew realises that would only give them 1 mark, which I think is perhaps a little bit harsh for this poor person. Do remember that mark band 1 actually scores no marks, and although I have actually seen assignments with no marks in at all against mark bands where it hasn't been addressed at all, the majority of students will actually get some marks, but I think perhaps 1 mark was a little bit harsh because this student had provided some evidence of analysis, which again, because you've not been able to see the full assignment, you haven't really got a full handle on, but nevertheless there was evidence of analysis throughout, and the learner had made an attempt at evaluation. There were some suggestions as to how the service could be improved. The writing style was quite good, although there were spelling and punctuation errors throughout, and so it was felt that this work sat towards the bottom of mark band 3, so it was given 6 marks, and Carl or Renee is going to publish the actual grid so that you can see the marks and see the comments that were given by the moderator. Thanks, Andrew. That's that's a bit kinder. Thank you. You did put them in mark band 3. I think some of you actually brought out some points about the fact that if the last one was marked band 4, this was definitely marked band 3, and you were absolutely right. This was a weaker piece of work, and there wasn't the evaluative skills there. It was more descriptive. One interesting point about the quality of written communication, what I have said to you is that if the quality of written communication is poor, you would take them down to the bottom of the mark band. Of course, that only applies if you're awarding marks in the top mark bands, because this mark band 3, is expecting frequent incidences of inaccurate spelling and punctuation and grammar. So you wouldn't penalise a student even further by knocking them down to the bottom of the mark band for poor quality of written communication, because that is expected by this particular mark band. So it's only if you're looking at the top 2 mark bands where where it should be a good level of quality of written communication that you would knock the learners down. I hope that's clear for you. Okay, if we can go back to the presentation, that would be great. Thank you. And just really to round off. So, we've looked at the results from last year, if you like, at the issues that were raised from last year. We've looked at the requirements of the assignment for 2012, 2013, so the one that you're going to be presenting in May 2013. And we've looked at a couple of assignments to try and get a handle on where you can award marks and what to look for when you're actually assessing portfolios. So hopefully you'll have an idea of what to look for. What I want to stress to you is that perhaps the key important point is to get the students to focus in on the tasks, not to go off and do anything that is not actually required by the tasks. So again, when you go away, if you look at those 2 portfolios, you will see that the portfolio that was presented by HC, for example, has got maps of where the service provider is, and has got all sorts of bits and pieces that are not required by the tasks. And while that is interesting, because it's not required, what has happened is that learner may have spent time doing all of that and has lost time in actually presenting evidence that is required by the tasks. So it's really important to get the learners to focus in on the tasks in the assignment and present evidence for those tasks. When you then come to assess, remember that it's really important for you to assess holistically, to look at the whole portfolio, to see where there is evidence of knowledge and understanding shown throughout all the tasks, where there is evidence of analysis shown throughout all the tasks, or application throughout all the tasks, and then award the marks for the individual assessment objectives and not beforehand. Okay, once you've assessed the portfolios and you've awarded your marks, of course, you then need to prepare for moderation. And I'm just going to run through some of the key things that you need to be aware of for moderation, because year on year we do have problems with samples that are sent and with the paperwork that's sent. So I thought if I ran through that for you, that would just clarify things. I've mentioned already, when you're assessing work, do annotate in the margin to identify where assessment criteria have been met. It does help the moderation process. We don't just look at that. Obviously, the moderators will look at your candidates' portfolios in detail. Moderation is not a reassessment. We are not assessing your candidate's work. We are moderating your assessment. We're looking to see if you have assessed accurately, or if you've awarded marks generously, or conversely that you've been too harsh. And we will always moderate positively. We're looking to try and support you as assessors, but we need to make sure that the evidence is there. And if you can actually identify where you think the assessment criteria have been met, it makes our job easier as moderators to say, yes, we can see why you have assessed that piece of work to that mark. So annotation is important. Do make sure that you select the correct sample to send to the moderator. when you will be, if you haven't done already, you will be entering your learners with Edexcel for this particular qualification. And in towards the end of April, you will receive from Edexcel a form called the Optem form. Now, the Optem form is it's got 3 pages to it. The top form is yellow, you then have a green, and you then have a pink form, and it's carbonated. On that Optem form, there will be all your candidates that you've entered listed, and next to some of their names, sorry, some of their numbers will be an asterisk. The asterisk indicates the portfolios that you have to send to your moderator. If you have a group of more than 10, you should send 10 portfolios. You should also send the highest and the lowest score if that isn't included within the 10. So you should be sending a maximum of 12 portfolios. The 10 that are asterisked plus the highest and lowest if not included within the 10. Do ensure that the candidate mark record sheet has been signed by both the learner and the assessor. Now, the candidate mark record sheets will be found, if you haven't got them, they are on the Edexcel website in the health and social care section, and you need to print those off. It's the same candidate mark record sheet for Unit 2 and Unit 3, and it's Unit 2 is on the top row. So you fill in the marks on the candidate mark record sheet, and both you and the candidate need to sign and date. The moderator's name will be on the Optem. At the bottom of the Optem there will be a sticky label with the moderator's name and address on it, and you need to obviously attach the sticky label to the envelope that you send them in. When you send the portfolios, you also need to include the yellow top, the yellow top copy. Sorry, it's the middle copy. The yellow copy needs to be included with the portfolios. The top copy is actually an orange and white striped copy, and that copy you need to send directly to Edexcel. The address is on the left-hand side in the margin. That must go to Edexcel because that is what will inform Edexcel of the marks that you have actually awarded. So the orange and white stripy copy, top copy, goes to Edexcel. The yellow copy should be included within the parcel with your portfolios, and then the green copy you keep for your records. Further support is available through Ask the Expert, excuse me, which you can access through edexcel.com and click on the teacher or head of department link. Questions about Unit 2 are usually assigned to me, so they'll come straight to me, and I usually try to get back to you within 24 hours. So if you've got any queries at all, please don't hesitate to ask. Now, I've quite a few questions that have come up, so I'm just going to see if I can answer them for you before we go. And if you have anything else, please don't hesitate to answer. We've got 5 minutes left, so let me just see if I can go through these in order. You mentioned about the primary school as a service provider, and can the students create a prospectus for the service provider? Yes, that would be ideal way of actually presenting the information for Task 1 to create a prospectus, because that's going to cover all the services and all the elements that's required for Task 1. Hannah, how do I find a service user? You're probably better to find a service provider first, and then see if there's anybody that they can recommend. If you use a visiting speaker, then they could bring a case study with them. If you don't put your students in placement, then you could use a case study again. If they go to placement, then I think it would be quite useful to ask the head or the teacher of the class, if they explain what they have to do, who might be a good case study to base their assignment on. So that's probably the best way of actually finding a service user. Worst case scenario, if they have a sibling, for example, who is who falls into the age range, or a grandma who falls into the age range, something like that, then they could use them. But they must be accessing the service provision. So, they can't just be a grandma that lives at home, because they're not in a residential care setting. So they must be accessing the service provision for them to meet the requirements. But they would be ways that they could actually find a service user. Andrew, coming back to you about care values, Andrew's asked for the good examples of care values. Do they have to include examples of all care values? They need to discuss all the care values in terms of the generic information at the beginning, but in terms of application, it might be that some of the care values are not relevant, particularly when you're thinking about the indirect worker. Some of the care values might not be relevant. For example, if an indirect worker won't necessarily have any direct contact with the service user, and so therefore it might be difficult for them to evidence how they would show respect. And that's just an idea off the top of my head. So it's the ones that are relevant, but they should have discussed all 5 care values. And just a tip for you all in terms of care values. Care values is a term that really is not widely used, believe it or not, particularly within health services, and to a certain extent within social care. I was doing a face-to-face presentation a couple of weeks ago in Manchester, and one of the teachers there had been a social worker, and she said when she was working as a social worker she never used the term care values. She knew what they were, so if the learner had said to her, how do you maintain confidentiality, she could have gone on at length. But in terms of, asking how do you implement the care values, it wasn't a term that she used. And certainly as a health visitor, which is my background, it wasn't a term that I ever used when I was health visiting. So if your students are putting together a questionnaire, I would advise them not to use the question, how do you implement the care values, but to go in specifically and, how do you maintain confidentiality, or how do you maintain dignity, and break it down like that. And I think that might be more useful for you. You've asked if Year 10 are currently doing the single award, is it the controlled assessment for May 13 or 14? If they're doing the single award, they will be submitting at the end of Year 10 in May 13, so it must be the assignment for September 2012 to May 2013. Sam, in order to get 10 to 12 marks, the learner would need to make more reference to organisational policies, industry codes of conduct, etc. I'm not sure which element you're referring to there, Sam. Perhaps you're looking at task 2, or in fact task 1 on this particular unit, and you could bring that in for the national framework element, but I really wouldn't get too hung up on organisational policies and industry codes of conduct. It's far too complicated for Year 10 and Year 11 students. Even the GCSE students wouldn't refer to that, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. When will these pieces of marked work be available on the website for greater consideration? You should be able to download them, I think. From here you'll be able to download the whole presentation, and that will include the pieces of work as well and the commentaries, so you should have them. They should have been sent out to you with the pre-event information. Jacqueline, you've asked the same question, will I be able to log back on to print out the scripts when I return to the work? I think so. I'm hoping that Renee is monitoring this conversation and will come back to me with an answer, but I'm pretty certain that once the presentation is finished, the whole presentation is published, and then you can actually download it. So you should be able to get it, yes. Sam, I've answered the question, could you use a family member? Yes, you can, providing they are actually accessing a service provider. Can teachers make up a case study? Yes, they can. That is quite acceptable for a case study. That's not a problem. Wendy, can I use one care provider with students? Yes, you can. As I've said already, it's very difficult for some centres to access care providers, service users and service providers. So if you use the same one, that is fine. The key is that the students work independently. When they're actually putting their work together, and if they don't, and yes, the primary school over the road would be fine. If they don't work independently, then you can't award marks at the top end for AO21. Right, and then I think possibly the final question, oops, just disappeared, sorry, there's a question from Josh. Josh, I have a general question about assignment entries. Current Year 10 class who have been entered for the double award. They are studying Unit 2 and will be doing so till the end of January. Right, which controlled assignment should they be doing? They need to do the one that is dated from September 2013 to to May 2014. Officially, it shouldn't be available until September 2013, but it is actually on the website already. So you need to make sure that they are doing the assignment that is dated from September 2013 to May 2014. Mary, you said doing the single award over 2 years, would it be the 2014 assignment? Yes, it would. It's the assignment that is relevant when you are cashing in the qualification. So if you're doing it over 2 years, it's again the September 2013 to May 2014 assignment, not the one I've gone over today. Gosh, loads of questions here. Right. Sorry, I'm just checking which ones I haven't answered. You said that you're confused about the assignment. It really depends on when you're going to cash in. If you have registered them for the single award, but you're not actually cashing in until May 2014, then it's the assignment May 2014 that you're doing. If you are cashing in at the end of this year, at the end of this academic year, then it is this year's assignment that you should be doing, the May 2013 assignment. I hope that's clarified that for you. It is confusing, and lots of people are getting confused. So she's found the portfolios within the delegate pack, so you have got access to all the portfolio, easy access to the portfolios. Louisa, again, I think I've answered this. Can Year 10 do the single award over 2 years? They can, but you have to register them. Of course, that's the key thing. Is when you register them. If you've already registered them with Edexcel for this year, which you probably haven't done yet, but if you have, then they have to do it this year. So my advice is, if you're doing the single award over 2 years, please do not register them with Edexcel until academic year 2013-2014. I hope that's clear. Okay, I think... Oh, what a problem. Right. When you started the unit in September, the only available assignment was this year's. Probably, my advice, if they're doing single award, Josh, my advice would be that you register them this year and continue with this assignment and cash in at the end of this year. That will mean that they have to do Unit 1 exam at the end of this year as well. But that's probably what I would do if they're a long way into the assignment and they've been working on it for a number of weeks. If you feel, have a look at the 2014 assignment, and if you feel that they can transfer their information across, then you've got the choice. But obviously it is different service users, different service providers. So my advice would probably be, if they're a long way into the assignment, I would register them this year for the single award and submit in May 2013, but do bear in mind that they will have to do the exam for Unit 1 in May as well. Okay, I think I've answered all the questions that are up. We are now at 6:04, so we have gone over a little bit of time. I hope that has been useful for you. And if anybody does have any more questions, I'm quite happy to stay on. But the presentation has finished. You have got access, or you will have access to the presentation at the end when it's been published. And all I can say is good luck, and I hope your learners do well. If you do have any other queries, and you don't want to stay and ask them now, then please do go through Ask the Expert, and I will try and answer any questions for you on Ask the Expert that this presentation may have raised, or any other questions that you have. But in the meantime, thank you very much for attending. I hope it's been useful, and good luck in the summer.